Crime Stories by Ira Robinson.
His Eyes by Ira Robinson. The car idled away quietly as she sat, waiting for the man to come. The parking lot was empty for the most part, though she could see a couple sitting in a car nearby, talking with one another. To calm her nerves, she imagined what they could be talking about to each other. Maybe they were arguing about bills or the way he was smoking his cigarettes without opening the windows. She had not seen the woman light one of her own, though she had been watching them for more than 15 minutes. A twinge of anxiety shot through her belly again as the thought of what she was there to do came floating back into her mind. She had never done anything like this before, never would have even imagined the possibility, but things had been pressed too far for too long, and she knew she had no other choice, even if that meant she was damned for doing it. She hoped it would not be much longer. She didn't know if she would be able to steel her resolve or staving off the anxiety as the passage of minutes continued on. Time was, as always, a bitch. Another car pulled into the parking lot, creaking through the ice and snow which had drifted across the pavement. Even through the closed windows of her car, she could hear the crunching as the thick treads of the vehicle overpowered the frozen water. Was it him? She tried to look surreptitiously, but the windows of the other car were tinted and she couldn't see well enough through them. She waited, pulling her purse closer to her chest from her lap. She could see movement in the other car through the tinting. It was subtle, but it was there as far as she could tell, and it was only one person in it. And that suited her. She only wanted one person, and any more would be nothing but trouble she couldn't handle. She unzipped her purse, exposing the contents to the air. She reached in without looking and pulled out the gun. It was cold in her hand, even with the heater in the car going on full blast, making the interior of the car hot and steamy. As she held it tightly by the grip, she could sense a subtle vibration in it, an ache of the deadly mechanism as it held itself back, barely, from firing on its own. She knew from practice how quick the trigger on this gun could be, and she was ready for it all to be over. She kept her finger off the trigger, but pointed it in a way that she could instantly bring its firepower to bear. She heard the other car door click as the person inside opened it to step out. She gripped the gun even tighter and put her free hand to the handle of her own door, ready to spring out in a heartbeat. She held her gaze tightly on the other car. The door swung wide and she saw the figure of a man stepping out. He was dressed in a dark pair of pants and a black duster, extending the length of his torso to the midpoint of his legs, covering it all against the bracing cold. It was him. She was sure of it, though he wore the collar of his coat high, hiding the bottom half of his face, and the sunglasses he wore blocked the view of his eyes from her sight. She was sure it was him. It was his bearing, the way he carried himself. It was unmistakable. She slipped her hand inside of her own coat, hiding the gun from sight, and then pulled the lever on her door, swinging it wide open. She stepped out as the man was readying himself to turn to walk toward the building nearby, and as she stepped out, he heard the sound and turned back again, facing her fully. Did he recognize her? She dreamed he would, as she had planned all this out, but as she stepped 1 foot closer to him, she saw his face remain passive. How could he not recognize her after all he had done? After all the hell she had been through, how could he just gaze at her as if she were nothing more than a stranger in the street? It pushed her anger even further, and she crossed the distance between them in a few steps, wrenching the gun from her coat and bringing it to bear. Did he recognize her now? She saw his eyebrows flare upward, and even as the trigger was pulled. The shot rang out loudly, deafening her for a moment as the bullet entered his chest just slightly off-center. The dark coat hid any sign of blood from the wound, but he staggered backward a few steps, gasping and crying out, though she was not able to hear it. He crumpled to the ground, falling to his back, and she saw the dirty snow was further marked by tinges of red as the blood swiftly poured from his back, evidence the shot had torn its way through his body. All traces of her anger toward him dissipated with the flow of the blood, replaced by a deep calm and satisfaction, knowing no one else would have to go through what she had at his hands. She watched as he gasped for air once, twice, and then a long exhale burst forth from his lungs, spreading the vapor from his heat into the cold. Not a word was said by either of them by the time that his last gleam of life faded away. She waited a moment more, knowing someone inside the building had probably heard the shot and already called the police. She watched for any movement from him, some trick he was pulling on her to get her to lower her guard, but the only movement was a slight twitching in his left foot. She held the gun stiff in front of her, aiming for his head, and then kicked out at his face to move the sunglasses. She wanted to see the look on his eyes before she was done. They skittered away across the icy pavement, sliding to a stop a few feet away from her car. She heard it, but she didn't pay any attention to where they landed. Instead, she was struck by the realization the man laying at her feet was not the one she thought he was. He was a complete stranger, and his dead eyes were locked on her own, piercing her through to the core. Crushing despair racked her instantly as the desperate look in his gaze became a part of her. It had been so simple. How could this have happened? What have I done? She backed away a step and then two, keeping her eyes on his own. All the tragedy her life had endured had come down to this singular moment, and she had somehow become the monster she had fought her whole life. She took another step back, and she felt something crunch beneath her foot, a plastic snap and a tinkle of glass. She didn't look at it. She couldn't pull her eyes away from the man laying in the snow. The nightmare of her life was complete. Another step back, and she felt the idling car she had driven for over an hour to come to this place. The vibration entered her, and she finally was able to close her eyes, even if it was for only a moment. She reached her free hand back and felt the metal of the car behind her and used it to steady herself a little as she tried fruitlessly to come to terms with what she had done. She opened her eyes again and met those of the man she had killed. That poor innocent man who had just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time watched her own movements with his leaded eyes, waiting for her next play. Coherent thought was gone from her as the gun raised upward, and she felt the cold of it against her temple. Will he laugh when he hears the news? She was gone before the sound of the shot entered her ears. For more stories from Ira Robinson, go to his official website, originalworlds.com. At that website, you'll find free stories, free chapters from his books, writing information for those up-and-coming authors, and much, much more. That's originalworlds.com. Thank you for listening.